I never thought waking up to the sound of metal scraping concrete would turn my life into a courtroom drama. But there I was peering through the kitchen window watching Karen, the HOA president, crowbar in hand, acting like she'd bought my backyard, along with her title. So, yeah, that's the hook, and if you think it's petty, wait. She hadn't seen me yet. She was shouting orders at two HOA officers and a couple of workmen as they tried to pry the posts of the privacy fence I'd installed the day before, and for a second I just froze because the fence was entirely on my land. Surveyor documented every inch cameras recording audio and video from the night before because I'd known she'd try something. I'm not just some homeowner. I'm someone who spent years fighting property battles for other people. And suddenly the thing I bought to save myself from fighting had become the thing I had to fight for. I was mid-30s and running on the fumes of burnout when I bought this place, which probably explains why the pool looked like a promise I could finally keep quiet. Mornings, late swims, weekends that didn't end in arguments, and I told myself I'd earned a corner of the world where nobody had the right to tell me how to hang my life. At first, the neighborhood was harmless enough. Polite nods, small talk about sprinklers, lawn care, the weather. Then the HOA elected new leadership, and with it arrived Karen, perfect hair, the smile that didn't get past the teeth, the kind of woman who carries a binder like a holy relic and behaves like she wrote the CC and Rs by hand. When I mentioned a privacy fence, she acted like I'd proposed building a fort. We like to keep the neighborhood open concept, she said, like privacy was a sin. The fence was legal, height materials placement checked, double-checked, notarized survey in hand. I'd walked the lot with the surveyor, watched him point out the old metal stake, the small orange markers, everything clean. Still, the second I stopped asking permission, they started inventing rules. Lost paperwork, incomplete forms, phantom committees that met quarterly. Even though the CC and Rs said nothing about them, contradictions piled up until I kept a folder just for the HOA's excuses. They weren't enforcing standards, they were enforcing obedience, and I'd become the target they wanted to break. You'd think knowing the pattern would make it easier, but experience is a cold comfort when it's aimed at your head. I'd seen the playbook before. Vague accusations, whisper campaigns, small fines that escalate into something that makes living there unbearable isolation as a weapon. My neighbors began to look at me differently. Subtle at first, a pause in a greeting, a curt nod, then colder, avoiding eye contact, steering their kids around my driveway. It's amazing how quickly a community can clip your wings when one loud voice decides you're the problem. The escalation was slow until it wasn't. I started catching them photographing my backyard angling phones over the hedge like they were waiting for a scandal, and then one night the gate was ajar. Footprints in the damp soil leading from the hedge to my deck. Not wind, not mistake. Someone had been on my property. That's trespass, plain and simple. My attorney friend said so. HOA officers don't get to trespass into private deeded space, no exceptions. That knowledge steadied me, and it also made me furious in a way that sharpened my thinking. If they wanted ammunition, I would give them the one thing they didn't expect: evidence. So I got methodical. Camera footage, time-stamped receipts, the surveyor's affidavit notarized in clean, every contradictory email printed and highlighted like a confession. When Karen and her crew marched onto my deck with a crowbar in broad daylight and started tearing the fence down, I hit record and I called the sheriff, because filing a complaint after the fact is one thing, but catching them in the act, tape rolling, changes the whole dynamic. Karen tried to play it cool, told the workers to continue, called it enforcing community standards. And for a moment I felt like I'd stepped into a surreal play where the director had forgotten the script said, "Obey the law." The deputies arrived faster than I expected. One walked the property line with me, looked at the survey markers, watched the footage on my phone, and said something small that felt huge. Neighborhood harmony isn't a legal standard. That sentence would echo in my head for weeks. It meant what I'd always believed: laws beat posturing. It also meant the story was no longer just mine. It was on a track that crossed into public records, into courtrooms, and ultimately into the living rooms of my neighbors. There was a twist in all of this, the kind that movie writers pray for, but real life rarely hands you, and it arrived in the form of a silent witness I'd nicknamed Clipboard Buddy. For weeks he'd followed Karen like a shadow, never speaking, just taking notes as if he were transcribing a verdict rather than a conversation. I assumed he was just another cog. What I didn't expect was that when the cameras and paperwork started piling up, Clipboard Buddy hesitated in a way I noticed only later, the micro expression of someone who suddenly realized the script they'd been reading might be a lie. At the courthouse, he didn't step up to defend her. Instead, his silence became a kind of evidence. A man who once scribbled in service of a narrative now sat quietly while it unraveled. Later, a local journalist reached out. Neighbors who'd been too afraid to speak started showing up at meetings, and people who'd learned to obey because it was easier than conflict finally looked at their own reflection in the mirror and didn't like what they saw. In court, I kept calm the way I'd learned to from years of legal wrangling, facts, not fury. I played the video of Karen on my deck, gave the judge the surveyor's affidavit, laid out the emails that contradicted themselves, and watched the whole charade crumple. The HOA's attorney spoke about community cohesion as if that replaced the law, and the judge mercifully asked the right question. Show me where spirit appears in your CC&Rs. Silence does a lot of damage in a courtroom. It did for her. The injunction came down immediate, precise, no more trespass, no more tampering, and the court said something I will never forget. I will not tolerate an HOA behaving like an enforcement agency with unchecked power. That line landed like a gavel on an old habit. Once the board saw the teeth they'd been biting into. A vote removed Karen as president. It was unanimous. The same people who once let her micromanage their lives now refused to stand for it. The HOA hit its reserve fund with fines for trespass and attempted property destruction, and suddenly the math of power shifted. When authority costs money, suddenly teeth look less sharp. But it wasn't just about money or the emptying of a binder that once felt heavy with power. It was about the quiet that returned to my yard. The first laugh across my pool in months felt huge, not because I'd won, but because I'd reclaimed a place where I could breathe. I realized the fight wasn't about wooden posts or legal technicalities. It was about dignity, the right to exist in your space without someone wielding rules like a club. I had spent years untangling other people's property fights, losing little pieces of myself along the way. And when that fence went up, it was more than privacy. It was a boundary I needed to heal. The moral slid in without a sermon. Rules are tools, not crowns. Structures help communities function, but when people mistake structure for authority, when they confuse enforcement for justice, someone has to hold the line. The lesson I walked away with felt less triumphant and more like an ache that opens into something kinder. Vigilance matters, but so does community. And sometimes the hardest thing is asking your neighbors to look up from their routines and see what's been happening in front of them. There was a satisfying moment, the kind that gives you that small, almost giddy relief when I painted the repaired fence, slow brushstroke sealing over the scuffs left by pry bars and the months of tension. And later when I stacked the box of violation letters on the curb for recycling and watched the truck carry them away. It felt like a private ritual to close a long chapter. The neighborhood softened. Neighbors who'd avoided me now waved and in time apologized. Kids played in the street again. HOA meetings turned into something useful. Accountability, boring, real procedural accountability, proved itself better than fear masquerading as order. So here's what I wanted you to think about. When does protecting a community become policing lives? At what point does keeping things pretty stop being about standards and start being about control? I'll tell you my take. Power unchecked breeds. Small cruelties served as duties. And the antidote is people willing to look to gather evidence and to stand up, not with fury, but with facts. If you've ever been on the receiving end of someone's authority turned mean, tell me what you did. Did you fight? Did you fold? Did you find a way out? Share your story, because we learn better from each other than from headlines. And if nothing else, let this be a nudge question. The person who tells you they speak for everyone. If you think this was about wood and nails, think again. It was about space dignity and the small, quiet rebellions that let us be ourselves. So tell me, where would you draw the line between neighborhood standards and personal sovereignty? And would you fight to keep your corner of the world? Share your thoughts below. I'd love to hear them.